Picture this. It is July of 1881. Washington, D.C. is sweltering under an oppressive summer heat that makes the air feel thick and heavy in your lungs. But the real tension isn't the weather. It's inside the White House. The President of the United States, James A. Garfield, is lying in a bed, bleeding profusely. He has just been shot in the back by an assassin at a train station. The situation is absolute, terrifying chaos. The greatest medical minds in the country are scrambling to the president's bedside, but they are utterly baffled. They cannot find the lead bullet. Every time they probe the wound, using unsterilized fingers and metal instruments, which was the standard of the day, they come up empty. The leader of the free world is fading fast, and 19th century medicine has hit a brick wall. In a desperate bid to save him, they do not call another doctor. They call upon a man who just 5 years earlier invented the telephone. Alexander Graham Bell rushes into the White House, carrying a hastily assembled, sci-fi sounding machine. To us, it is basically the world's first metal detector, built virtually overnight just for this crisis. He literally passes an electromagnetic wand over the president's body, listening through an earpiece for a telltale hum. A hum that will locate the shrapnel and guide the surgeon's knife. It sounds like a Hollywood script. The brilliant inventor stepping out of his lane to play the superhero. But when you dig into the historical sources, you realize this single moment is just one tiny, strange fragment of a life that is so much more bizarre, brilliant, and deeply troubling than most of us ever learned in school. We know Alexander Graham Bell as the guy who connected the globe, the telephone guy. But you don't know the man who spent decades trying to erase an entire culture's language. Today, we are unpacking the deeply controversial, multidimensional life of a man who just couldn't stop tinkering with humanity. This is not going to be a simple hero's journey. The historical records reveal a life riddled with massive historical mysteries, including compelling, heavily documented accusations of patent theft, corporate espionage, and bribery that shaped modern telecommunications. And perhaps most unsettling of all, a dark, polarizing crusade involving the deaf community and the American eugenics movement. How does a man who spent his life obsessed with communication simultaneously try to silence a marginalized community? Welcome to Legendary Lives Unveiled. If you are ready to look past the myths and uncover the terrifying, tragic, and profound truths of history's greatest icons, make sure to like this video, share it with a fellow history nerd, and subscribe to our channel. To understand the paradox of the hero and the villain, we have to start in the environment that forged his mind. Edinburgh, Scotland. March 3rd, 1847. Known as the Athens of the North, it was a massive hub of intellectual and scientific thought. Young Alexander, who actually just went by Alexander Bell at birth and added Graham as an 11th birthday present to himself, was born into a family that treated the mechanics of sound like a religion. His grandfather was a famous professor of elocution in London. His father, Alexander Melville Bell, was even more renowned in the same field. Melville invented a rigorous, highly scientific system of phonetic symbols called visible speech. It was a physiological alphabet. Instead of representing sounds arbitrarily like the letter A or B, Melville's symbols visually depicted the exact physical positioning of your mouth, lips, tongue, throat, and palate, required to produce any given sound. If you knew the symbols, you could accurately pronounce words in a language you had never even heard before, simply by placing your vocal organs exactly where the drawing instructed. Young Alexander was raised in an environment where sound wasn't just something you passively hear. It was a physical, mechanical reality. It was almost like plumbing, valves and airflow that could be analyzed, mapped, and manipulated. But amidst this hyper-focus on the mechanics of perfect speech, the center of Bell's emotional world, his mother Eliza, was deaf. Eliza began losing her hearing from a childhood illness and was almost completely deaf by the time Bell was 12. She navigated her world as a proficient pianist, using a long ear tube, almost like a trumpet, to try and catch the sounds of the room. Alexander learned the British manual alphabet, spelling out conversations into her hand using 2 hands. But there is a vivid image from the sources that reveals his true obsession. He would often bypass the ear tube entirely. He would press his lips directly against his mother's forehead while he spoke in low, booming tones. He was utilizing bone conduction. By speaking directly into her forehead, she could feel the physical vibrations of his voice resonating through her skull directly to her auditory nerve. He loved his mother deeply and saw her isolation. But because of his family's rigid background in phonetic science, he viewed her deafness not as a cultural identity, but as a mechanical barrier, a physical problem of vibrations and acoustics that just needed to be hacked or conquered. That is the foundation of his entire worldview. He believed that with enough mechanical ingenuity, the silent world could be forced to participate in the hearing world. He was so intensely obsessed with imposing speech on the silent that he literally tried to teach his dog, a Skye Terrier, to talk. He would feed the dog treats to get it to growl continuously, and while the dog was growling, Bell would manually reach into the dog's mouth with his hands, manipulating its vocal cords, lips, and jaw, trying to physically force the animal to articulate the phrase, "How are you, Grandmama?" It showcases a relentless, almost hubristic desire to mold the world to his auditory specifications. This intense focus took on a tragic urgency when his family was struck by a terrifying tuberculosis epidemic. In the late 1860s, both of his brothers died from it, and Bell himself was sickly, suffering from chronic headaches and exhaustion. Fearing they would lose their last remaining son to the smog and damp of Britain, his parents made a drastic decision. In 1870, they uprooted their lives and moved to a farm in Brantford, Ontario in Canada, hoping the crisp, clean air would save him. It actually worked. Bell recovered his health, and a year later, he moved down to Boston, where his professional life truly detonated. He opened a private practice teaching his father's visible speech system to deaf students. His early roster of students was incredibly influential to his future. He tutored a young boy named George Sanders, whose wealthy leather merchant father became crucial to his later financing. He also tutored a young woman named Mabel Hubbard, who had lost her hearing to scarlet fever at age 5 and was entirely deaf. She would eventually become his wife, his greatest confidant, and the primary financier of his later inventions. Later in his life, he also met a 6-year-old Helen Keller, becoming a lifelong friend and mentor to her. He directed her family to the Perkins School for the Blind, which led her to her famous teacher, Anne Sullivan. He even set up a trust fund to pay for Helen's education at Radcliffe College, and she later dedicated her autobiography to him, saying he helped her conquer the solitude of silence. On an interpersonal level, he was incredibly generous, patient, and devoted to the deaf individuals in his orbit. But structurally, because of his phonetic upbringing, he championed a philosophy called oralism. He firmly believed that for deaf people to survive and integrate into the mainstream hearing world, they had to be taught to speak and lip-read, and that visual sign language should be actively discouraged, if not outright banned. His motivation was undoubtedly rooted in a desire for integration. He saw hearing society as the default and wanted his loved ones to have access to it without being ostracized. But did he want to build a bridge, or did he want to force them to cross over entirely to his side and burn their own bridge behind them? Forcing someone to abandon their natural visual language just so they can imperfectly mimic the majority through exhausting physical effort sounds less like building a bridge and more like cultural colonization. We will dive much deeper into his dark crusade against sign language later. But for now, you must see how this obsessive desire to transmit sound vibrations across a physical barrier directly fueled his moonlighting gig. By day, he was a teacher of the deaf, manipulating lips and vocal cords. By night, he was a tinkerer, manipulating wires and electricity. The big technological holy grail of the 1870s was not the telephone. The tech giants wanted the harmonic telegraph. The Western Union Telegraph Company held a massive monopoly over the telegraph, the internet of its day. But it had a severe physical bottleneck. A single wire could only carry one message at a time. Western Union was desperate for a multiplexing system to send multiple messages simultaneously over a single wire. If someone could invent that, they would practically own the future of global commerce. Bell theorized that if you tuned multiple telegraph transmitters to different musical frequencies, like different keys on a piano, you could send them all down the same wire simultaneously. Receivers, on the other end, tuned to those specific frequencies, would separate the messages. He secured financial backing from Thomas Sanders and Gardner Green Hubbard, the fathers of his students. They hired a highly skilled young electrician from a Boston machine shop named Thomas A. Watson to be his hands, as Bell was notoriously clumsy with actual tools and batteries. But here, the narrative shifts from a story of noble acoustic research to a story of intense corporate espionage, cutthroat legal warfare, and a race to the patent office that remains highly controversial to this day. The timeline is incredibly tight. The date is February 14th, 1876, Valentine's Day. On that morning, Bell's lawyer, Marcellus Bailey, walks into the U.S. Patent Office in Washington, D.C., and files an application for an invention titled Improvements in Telegraphy. But on that exact same day, just a few hours later, a highly respected inventor named Elisha Gray walks into the same building. Gray, who had co-founded Western Electric, files a caveat, a formal legal placeholder, for a very similar device. Crucially, Gray's caveat sketched out a telephone that used a liquid transmitter. A needle attached to a diaphragm rested in a small cup of acidic liquid. As the sound waves caused the needle to bob in the acid, the electrical resistance dropped and increased, perfectly mapping the physical sound waves to fluctuating electricity. They both hit the patent office on the exact same day. Under normal circumstances, the patent office would declare an interference to investigate who conceived the idea first. Initially, the patent examiner, a man named Zenas Fisk Wilbur, did exactly that, suspending Bell's application. But that suspension mysteriously evaporates. On March 7th, 1876, Alexander Graham Bell is officially awarded U.S. Patent Number 174,465, often called the most valuable single patent in history. And just 3 days later, using a liquid transmitter incredibly similar to the one Gray sketched, Bell transmits the first intelligible human speech to Watson. "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." History is made. Bell becomes a legend. But the shadows surrounding those few weeks in early 1876 are incredibly dark. The most explosive piece of evidence regarding what happened between February 14th and March 7th comes directly from the patent examiner himself, Zenas Fisk Wilbur. In 1886, 10 years after the fact, Zenas Fisk Wilbur signed a sworn affidavit making an unbelievable confession. He admitted that he was a severe alcoholic. He also admitted that he was heavily in debt to Bell's lawyer, Marcellus Bailey, a man he had served with in the Civil War and who had been lending him money to fund his drinking. According to Wilbur's sworn statement, shortly after he suspended Bell's application, Bailey came to visit him, and Wilbur claimed he illegally showed Bailey the contents of Elisha Gray's top-secret caveat. It gets worse. Wilbur claimed that when Bell himself came to Washington a few days later to sort out the interference, Wilbur showed Bell the caveat. He explicitly explained Gray's liquid transmitter method to him, and in return, Bell slipped him a $100 bill. $100 in 1876 is roughly equivalent to $3,000 today. A massive, blatant bribe. And the plot thickens even more when you look at the actual paperwork. In the margins of Bell's original patent application, there are 7 highly specific sentences describing the variable resistance method, the exact liquid method Gray was using. Critics and historians later pointed out that these 7 sentences seem to magically appear, almost like they were hurriedly inserted after the fact. Bell vehemently, under oath, denied ever paying Wilbur a bribe. He admitted that Wilbur informed him his patent was in conflict with a caveat regarding variable resistance, but Bell claimed Wilbur only spoke in general administrative terms, which was permitted. Bell also pointed out that he had been theorizing about liquid transmitters long before Gray's caveat, and there were rudimentary sketches in his laboratory notebooks to prove it. Furthermore, Elisha Gray made a fatal tactical error. Acting on bad advice from his own patent attorney, Gray voluntarily abandoned his caveat. In 1876, the telephone was seen as a parlor trick, a novelty toy. The serious venture capital was entirely focused on the multiplex telegraph. Gray's lawyer told him to focus on the real business of telegraphy and not to waste time fighting over a toy. By the time Gray realized his mistake, Bell had already secured the patent and the commercial high ground. Gray essentially folded a royal flush because he didn't realize the pot was worth billions. But looking at the facts, the government examiner owing Bell's lawyer money, admitting to a bribe, admitting to showing secret documents, and Bell's final patent, relying on the exact technology Gray proposed, it looks incredibly damning. How did Bell win the legal fights that followed? The legal system ultimately sided with Bell, and it came down to a profound scientific concept that Bell understood better than anyone else: the undulating current. Most inventors of the era, including Gray and the great Thomas Edison, approached telecommunications with a telegrapher's mindset. The telegraph works on an intermittent current. It is binary. You tap the key, the circuit closes, electricity flows. You lift the key, the circuit breaks, the electricity stops. On, off, on, off. Like communicating with a blinking flashlight. You can send dots and dashes that way, but you cannot send a human voice, which has complex pitch, tone, and delicate overtones. Bell, because of his deep background in acoustics and speech physiology, realized that to transmit a voice, the electrical circuit could never be broken. The current had to flow continuously, rising and falling in a smooth wave-like manner, undulating, perfectly mirroring the density of the airwaves created by the vocal cords. Instead of a blinking flashlight, you needed a dimmer switch that could constantly, instantly, adjust its brightness to match the exact shape of a sound wave. The courts found that this conceptual leap, the continuous undulating current, was the foundational soul of the telephone. And the written record proved that this concept belonged entirely to Bell. But it wasn't just one quick settlement. Over the next 18 years, the Bell Telephone Company fought over 600 separate lawsuits defending that single patent. They fought Elisha Gray. They fought the behemoth, Western Union. They even fought Thomas Edison. Western Union had actually hired Edison to invent a way around Bell's patent. Edison, being brilliant, invented the carbon button transmitter, which used compressed carbon dust that changed resistance when sound waves compressed it. Vastly superior to Bell's liquid, or early electromagnetic transmitters. Western Union started rolling out their own phones using Edison's tech, sparking a massive corporate war. They eventually capitulated in 1879. Realizing Bell's underlying patent was ironclad, they handed over all their telephone patents, including Edison's carbon microphone, in exchange for a 20% cut of the revenues for the life of the patent. This settlement effectively gave the Bell Telephone Company an absolute monopoly over telecommunications. But the victory came at an immense personal cost. The stress of being dragged into courtrooms for nearly 2 decades, being called a thief, a fraud, and a liar in over 600 cases, caused a massive psychological breakdown in Bell. The historical sources show he developed chronic insomnia, physical ailments, and a profound depression. He grew to absolutely despise his own creation. He hated the constant shrill ringing and the interruptions to his thoughts. He actually refused to have a telephone installed in his private study. It is a profound historical irony. The man who permanently connected humanity couldn't stand the noise it created. He just wanted to be left alone in his study to think in silence. So, what does a restless genius do when he hates his most famous invention, has a mountain of patent wealth, and wants to escape endless legal drama? He pivots. Using the money from the prestigious Volta Prize, a French scientific award he received for the telephone, he establishes the Volta Laboratory in Washington, D.C. He wants to focus on medical technology and entirely new forms of communication that don't involve messy wires. This leads to an invention that Bell himself considered his true masterpiece. In 1880, alongside his assistant Charles Sumner Tainter, Bell invents the photophone. Instead of transmitting sound waves over a physical copper wire using electricity, the photophone transmitted sound on a beam of pure light. They used a flexible mirror. You speak into a mouthpiece attached to the back of the mirror. The sound waves of your voice cause the mirror to vibrate slightly. By directing a beam of intense sunlight onto this vibrating mirror, the reflected light beam would modulate, brightening and dimming in exact accordance with the sound waves. They caught the light beam hundreds of yards away using a parabolic receiver equipped with a selenium cell. Selenium is a unique element whose electrical resistance changes based on how much light hits it. The fluctuating light beam hit the selenium, converting the light back into a fluctuating electrical current, which was fed into a standard telephone receiver and turned back into sound. They successfully transmitted a voice over 200 yards using this method. Bell practically conceptualized fiber optic communication a full century ahead of his time. The underlying physics of pulsing light to carry data is exactly how our modern internet works today. But he was ultimately limited by the environment of the 19th century. If a cloud passed over the sun, the call dropped. He lacked the laser technology to create a coherent light beam, and he lacked the glass fiber optic cables needed to protect that beam from the atmosphere. And the environment wouldn't just thwart his optical dreams, it would turn his next great invention into a national tragedy. Which brings us back to that cinematic opening. July 1881. President James A. Garfield is shot by Charles Guiteau. The chief physician taking care of Garfield is a deeply arrogant man named Dr. Willard Bliss, whose actual first name was Doctor. Believe it or not. Bliss has taken complete tyrannical control over the president's care. He and his team are repeatedly probing the bullet wound with their unsterilized fingers and metal surgical instruments, desperately looking for the lead. The germ theory of disease was still highly controversial in America, so they were introducing massive amounts of bacteria deep into his body. Bell reads about this and realizes that an electrical induction balance could detect the metal bullet without invasive probing. If you send an alternating electrical current through a primary coil of wire, it creates a fluctuating magnetic field. If you bring that field near a lead bullet, it induces tiny electrical currents known as eddy currents inside the metal. Those eddy currents create their own tiny magnetic field, which disrupts the balance of the machine and creates a hum in a secondary coil. Bell works feverishly, testing his new metal detector on Civil War veterans who still have shrapnel lodged in their bodies. It works perfectly. He brings the device to the White House, passes the electromagnetic wand over Garfield's abdomen, and listens intently. But instead of a clear localized signal, he gets static. A confusing, dull hum all over the president's back. The machine wasn't broken. Unbeknownst to Bell, Dr. Bliss had placed the president on a brand new, highly luxurious item. A mattress fitted with steel coil springs. The induction balance was picking up the massive amount of metal directly beneath the president, completely masking the tiny signature of the bullet. Bell eventually suspected the bed might be interfering, but Dr. Bliss viewed Bell as a tinkerer, interfering with medical science, and utterly refused to let Bell move the president to a wooden table. Bell drops everything to be a superhero, conceptualizes a metal detector overnight, and is completely thwarted by a mattress spring and a doctor's ego. Garfield died 79 days later. Autopsies revealed he did not die from the bullet itself, which had safely encased itself in a harmless cyst. He died from massive systemic infections caused by the unsterile hands and instruments of Dr. Bliss and his team. Bell was devastated, and the tragedies of 1881 weren't over. Just a month after Garfield died, Bell's own newborn son, who arrived prematurely, died of respiratory failure due to underdeveloped lungs. It was a crushing, deeply personal blow. But once again, Bell channels his intense grief into invention. Watching his tiny son struggle to breathe, he conceives a machine to mechanically assist respiration. A vacuum jacket, a sealed, airtight cylinder that fits securely around a patient's chest. By using a bellows to mechanically alter the air pressure inside the cylinder, creating a vacuum and then releasing it, it physically forced the patient's lungs to expand and contract. He literally invented the precursor to the iron lung decades before the horrific polio epidemics of the 20th century made them a necessity. His desire to fix human ailments with mechanical science was so noble when applied to respiratory failure or locating a bullet. But we must cross the threshold now into the darkest, most controversial chapter of Bell's legacy. Because when Bell took that exact same mechanical fixing mindset, the idea that science should intervene to correct physical deviations from the norm, and applied it to human genetics and deaf culture, he ignited a cultural war that is still being fiercely fought today. We have to talk about the bitter 40-year rivalry between Alexander Graham Bell and Edward Minor Gallaudet. Gallaudet was the president of the Columbia Institution for the Deaf and Dumb, which eventually became Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., the only liberal arts college for the deaf in the world. Gallaudet and Bell represented two fundamentally opposed philosophies regarding human existence. Gallaudet was a passionate champion of manualism, the use of sign language. Having grown up with a deaf mother himself, Gallaudet understood that sign language was not a crude set of gestures. It was a natural, fully realized language, a beautiful, highly expressive medium that allowed for complex philosophical thought, deep community bonding, and rapid education. He championed the combined method, using sign language for instruction while offering speech therapy as a secondary tool. Then you have Bell, the champion of oralism. Because of his hyperfixation on phonetics, Bell viewed deafness strictly as a pathological condition, a medical defect that needed to be cured, bypassed, or hidden through rigorous speech therapy. He publicly stated that sign language was a primitive foreign pantomime that actively isolated the deaf from what he considered normal society. And Bell did not just hold this as a quiet personal opinion. He aggressively weaponized his immense global fame, his vast patent wealth, and his political influence to systematically eradicate sign language from the educational system. The pivotal, devastating moment in this crusade came in 1880 at the Second International Congress on Education of the Deaf, held in Milan, Italy. The infamous Milan Conference wasn't an open scientific debate. It was a rigged ambush, entirely orchestrated and stacked with oralist supporters aligned with Bell's philosophy. Bell and his European allies presented their absolute best, most successful oral students. Crucially, these were mostly students who had lost their hearing later in childhood, meaning they already possessed a foundation of spoken language before becoming deaf. But they presented these specific cases as proof that the oral method worked effortlessly for everyone. The advocates for manualism and American Sign Language were actively marginalized and given barely any time to present their counter-arguments. The result was disastrous for the deaf community. The Congress passed a formal resolution declaring that the oral method was incontestably superior to signs. It effectively banned the use of sign language in deaf schools worldwide. The fallout from Milan was immediate, widespread, and devastating. Across the United States and Europe, deaf teachers who relied on sign language were systematically fired from their jobs. Deaf children in residential schools were literally forced to sit on their hands in classrooms to prevent them from signing. If they were caught communicating in their natural visual language, they were physically punished. They were forced through grueling, often humiliating, speech therapy drills, spending hours feeling their teachers' throats, trying to articulate sounds they could not hear, often at the total expense of learning actual subjects like history, math, or science. It robbed entire generations of deaf children of a cohesive education and a shared cultural language. It is horrifying to realize that the man who connected the hearing world was actively working to disconnect the deaf world. But Bell didn't stop at the classroom door. He took his crusade out of education and directly into the realm of genetics. In 1883, he presented a massive paper to the National Academy of Sciences titled Memoir upon the formation of a deaf variety of the human race. This document is perhaps his most controversial, polarizing work. Bell utilized his vast resources to compile extensive statistical data on deaf families across America. He showed that deaf people who socialized together, went to residential schools together, and shared sign language were highly likely to intermarry. And he issued a stark warning that this continuous intermarriage would inevitably lead to the creation of a genetically defective deaf race. He treated deafness like an invasive weed that needed to be systematically pruned from the human genome. He aligned himself directly with the emerging American eugenics movement. By 1921, his influence was so highly regarded in those circles that he was named the honorary president of the Second International Congress of Eugenics. We must be highly precise here, though, to maintain historical accuracy. Bell did not cross the line into advocating for the forced, state-mandated sterilization laws that later More radical eugenicists successfully pushed through in the 20th century. In his writings, he explicitly noted that a free society could not legislate who men and women should marry, believing such laws would only promote immorality. His solution was aggressive, structural social engineering. He actively lobbied state legislatures to close down state-funded residential schools for the deaf, arguing that bringing deaf children together in one place was the root of the problem. He wanted them mainstreamed into hearing public schools as isolated individuals. He wanted to eradicate American Sign Language entirely, so they couldn't communicate easily with one another. He even suggested trying to prevent deaf adults from hiring deaf teachers or forming social clubs. His underlying logic was brutally calculating. If you isolate a deaf person among hearing people, force them to read lips, and prevent them from finding a deaf community, they will eventually have no choice but to marry a hearing person, thus diluting the defective genes into the broader hearing population. He entirely and fundamentally missed the concept of a cultural identity. He didn't see deafness with a capital D. He couldn't comprehend that they were a distinct community with their own rich art, humor, poetry, and shared lived experience. He just looked at them and saw broken acoustic machines. The cognitive dissonance here is massive, on a galactic scale. He is deeply, profoundly in love with his deaf wife, Mabel. He supports and is adored by Helen Keller. Yet he actively lobbies to systematically dismantle the very culture and community that gives people exactly like his wife and his protege a sense of belonging. It is the ultimate paradox of the benevolent oppressor. It is like a brilliant doctor who is so fanatically obsessed with curing a disease that he accidentally declares war on the patient. Bell genuinely, paternalistically, believed he was saving the deaf from a life of isolation, completely blind to the reality that his cure, stripping away their natural language and community, was throwing them into a far more brutal kind of psychological solitary confinement. Edward Minor Gallaudet fought him tooth and nail on this for 4 decades. Gallaudet recognized that robbing the deaf of their visual language was robbing them of their human identity. And while Bell largely won the political and educational battles in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, successfully imposing oralism across the majority of the country, history eventually vindicated Gallaudet. American Sign Language survived underground in the dormitories when the teachers weren't looking. It was passed down from older students to younger students, and it saw a massive, undeniable resurgence in linguistic validation in the 1960s. That tension remains an active, painful part of Bell's legacy within the deaf community today. But as Bell grew older, entering his 60s and 70s, the bitter controversies of human genetics and the endless, exhausting patent lawsuits seemed to weary his soul. His mind, always restless, always seeking the next frontier, refused to stay tethered to the ground. As he ages, he looks up to the skies and out to the seas. In the 1890s, Bell and Mabel purchased land and built a massive, sprawling summer estate on a peninsula in Nova Scotia, Canada, called Bainbrig, and it is vital to note the role of Mabel Bell here. She is not just a supportive wife in the background. She is his primary financier and business manager. She managed the vast wealth flowing from the telephone patents, funding and encouraging his wild, highly expensive new experiments. By the early 1900s, Bell is fascinated with aeronautics. In 1907, at Mabel's direct suggestion and with her funding, he forms the Aerial Experiment Association, or AEA. He brings in young, brilliant, hungry minds like Glenn Curtiss, a genius with lightweight motorcycle engines, and a Canadian engineer named Casey Baldwin. While the Wright brothers were risking their lives working with fragile biplane gliders, Bell was obsessed with kite structures, specifically tetrahedral kites. They were visually stunning, massive, honeycomb-like structures made of dozens, sometimes hundreds, of small triangular pyramids. Tetrahedrons built from spruce wood and covered in maroon silk. He used maroon specifically because it showed up best against the gray sky. In early black and white photographs, they looked like floating alien spacecraft hovering over the Canadian lakes. He actually built kites large enough to carry a man into the air while being towed by a steamship. Ultimately, the AEA realized the kites created too much drag, so they moved to more conventional winged aircraft. But they didn't just copy the Wright brothers. They fundamentally advanced the science of aerodynamics. The Wright brothers controlled the roll of their aircraft using wing warping, an incredibly clumsy, aerodynamically inefficient system of pulleys and cables that physically twisted the wooden fabric of the entire wing. The AEA developed a far superior method. They placed small hinged flaps on the trailing outer edge of the wings. They called them ailerons, from the French word for little wing. When you move a lever, the aileron on the right wing angles downward, pushing that wing up, while the left aileron angles upward, pushing that wing down. The plane smoothly rolls. It requires very little physical force, causes no structural stress to the main wing, and provides incredibly precise control. This is the exact mechanism that every single modern airplane uses to steer and bank today. They attach these ailerons to their aerodynamic masterpiece, the Silver Dart. On February 23, 1909, with an aging Alexander Graham Bell watching nervously from a horse-drawn sleigh on the frozen ice of Baddock Bay, the Silver Dart roars to life with Casey Baldwin at the controls. It takes off and flies for half a mile, the first powered controlled flight in Canada and the entire British Empire. True to his nature, Bell didn't stop. He and Casey Baldwin immediately pivoted to hydrodynamics, hydrofoils. Realizing a traditional boat hull creates massive energy-sucking drag, and water is 800 times denser than air, they applied aerodynamic principles underwater. They designed a boat equipped with submerged wing-like structures attached to struts beneath the hull. As the boat speeds up, water rushing over the curved shape of the foils generates lift, generating so much upward force that they lift the entire massive hull of the boat completely out of the water. The drag practically drops to zero, and the boat basically flies a few feet above the surface. After years of prototyping, in 1919, they unveil their masterpiece, the HD-4. It was a 60-foot-long, cigar-shaped beast, painted naval gray, and powered by two massive Renault aircraft engines provided by the U.S. Navy. Tearing across the surface at 70.86 miles per hour, they set a world marine speed record that stood completely unchallenged for a decade. He wasn't just tinkering in a shed. He was fundamentally pushing the boundaries of physics in multiple distinct disciplines simultaneously: acoustics, optics, aerodynamics, and hydrodynamics. And amidst all this physical engineering, he managed to radically transform the world of publishing. Bell served as the second president of the National Geographic Society from 1898 to 1903. When he took over, it was a highly technical, dry, boring academic journal filled with dense geological data and losing money fast. He brought in his brilliant son-in-law, Gilbert Grosvenor, with a simple mandate: leave the technical jargon behind and fill the pages with beautiful, full-page photographs and engaging, accessible writing. They turned it into the iconic yellow-bordered visual powerhouse that brought the world into millions of living rooms. If Alexander Graham Bell had never messed around with telegraph wires, he would still be in the history books. He'd be remembered for giving us airplane ailerons, the world marine speed record, the conceptual foundation of fiber optics, the precursor to the iron lung, and the modern National Geographic magazine. His brain was constantly churning out world-altering ideas across completely unrelated fields. Yet he was also a rigid product of his time who sought to constrain and eradicate the natural diversity of the human experience through his crusade against the deaf community. You cannot neatly separate the man who saved the infant, struggling to breathe, from the man who told deaf adults they shouldn't marry. They are driven by the exact same instinct, a relentless need to manipulate the physical world until it conforms to his ideal standard. Nowhere is that deep paradox more profound or more poignant than at the very end of his life. August 6th, 1922. Bell is 75 years old. He is lying in bed at his Bribe mountain estate in Nova Scotia, his body failing from complications of diabetes and pernicious anemia. It's the middle of the night, roughly 2 a.m. The moonlight is shining over the dark waters of the lake, where he once flew his massive maroon kites and raced his roaring hydrofoils. His wife, Mabel, is sitting beside him. This is the deaf woman who inspired his earliest acoustic work, strategically managed his vast wealth, funded his wildest aeronautical dreams, and stood by him through decades of brutal patent wars and public controversies. She is holding his hand in the dark. She knows the end is rapidly approaching, and she whispers to him in a voice she cannot hear, "Don't leave me." Bell looks up at her. He is too weak to speak. His vocal cords, the physical organs he spent his entire life obsessively analyzing, mapping, and trying to master, fail him completely. He has no voice left. The man who spent his life, his immense wealth, and his vast political power trying to eradicate manual sign language on the face of the earth relies on it in his final, desperate moment. He uses his last ounce of physical strength to move his fingers, signing the word "no" into his wife's hand. He loses consciousness shortly after and dies. A profoundly poetic, heartbreaking, and deeply contradictory end to a legendary life. He leaves us with a legacy that is impossible to view cleanly. If you found yourself captivated by the brilliant sparks and the hidden controversial shadows of this story, hit the subscribe button, like this video, and share it with a fellow history nerd. We are Legendary Lives Unveiled, and we rely on your support to keep peeling back the layers of history's most fascinating figures. Drop a comment below. Do you think Alexander Graham Bell was a brilliant savior, a ruthless thief, a benevolent oppressor, or something in between? Keep questioning the narratives you've been taught. Keep learning the hidden mechanics of history, and we'll see you next time on Legendary Lives Unveiled.